There is a strange truth buried in the Cold War's old field. Manual's one that most modern survival enthusiasts tend to miss entirely. Today, when people think of concealment, their minds jump straight to the classic ghillie suit, the thick, heavy, vegetation-stuffed creation of snipers. But during the long tense decades, between the 1950s and the late 1980s, the armies watching each other from behind barbed wire and border zones were quietly relying on something very different. Something leaner, smarter, and in many real battlefield situations far more effective. It wasn't bulky. It didn't suffocate the wearer with heat. It didn't require hours of weaving jute or tying on clumps of grass that could wilt or change color. Instead, it was a simple system. So simple that many dismissed it at first glance, yet it allowed reconnaissance patrols, forward observers, and even sappers to operate far closer to enemy lines than most people today would ever imagine. And they did it in an era long before drones, long before digital optics, when the human eye and early surveillance lenses were the dominant tools of detection. Veterans from both NATO and Warsaw Pact units later admitted that this forgotten technique blended better in mixed terrain, stood up longer in wet environments, and avoided the one weakness that ghillie suits could never escape. Their bulk created recognizable shapes, especially when viewed from odd angles or from above. What was designed to break up the outline of a soldier often created a brand new outline of its own. This Cold War alternative took a completely different approach. Instead of building mass, it removed Italiano. Instead of creating a false shape, it broke the shape through light, shadow, and irregularity. Troops wore ultra-thin mesh garments, sometimes called fragmentation overlays, or mesh over break straight, loosely over uniforms that had been streaked or specked with narrow lines of contrasting tones. Tda wasn't to look like a bush. It was to look like nothing with a distinct edge. Light passed through the mesh. Shadows formed in unpredictable patterns. The body's silhouette simply dissolved into the environment. Field tests conducted throughout the 1970s repeatedly showed that soldiers using this system were harder to detect, especially from aerial observation. Even in winter wear, traditional ghillie suits often became heavy. Dark blobs standing out against pale terrain. The mesh-based method still disrupted outlines effectively. It didn't rely on vegetation. It relied on the eye's own blind spots. And the beauty of it was how simple it remained. Anyone today could replicate the process with almost nothing. A piece of wide-weave mesh, some lightweight netting, even surplus mosquito material. Troops would paint narrow, uneven streaks onto their uniforms, one tone to match soil or bark, another darker tone for shadow, a lighter one for highlight. Not a pattern, not camouflage in the traditional sense, but visual chaos. Then they'd drape the mesh over it with just a few anchor points, letting it flutter and shift naturally. The combination created a kind of micro-disruption that no bulky suit could match. This wasn't just theory. Border patrols in Germany, long-range reconnaissance units in the Soviet Far East, and NATO observers working near restricted zones consistently reported that ghillie suits snagged on branches, trapped water, and overheated the wearer during long movements. The mesh overlays had none of these issues. They weighed almost nothing, dried quickly, and stayed comfortable even through hours of crawling, climbing, or lying in wet terrain. The system had another advantage too: uniformity. Classic ghillie suits depend on the foliage around you, but foliage changes. It dries, yellows, shifts with the seasons, or looks completely different just 100 meters away. The mesh overlay system didn't care. It didn't imitate the environment. It disrupted the shape. A soldier could move from forest to brush to rocky ground without rebuilding their camouflage. And in the unpredictable, often fast-changing reality of Cold War patrol zones, that flexibility was priceless. What makes this technique even more remarkable is that it still works today. Modern drones, despite all their upgrades, still detect outlines first. Modern optics still struggle when an object doesn't have a clean edge. The principles of human vision haven't changed. Breaking the silhouette is still one of the most powerful forms of passive camouflage, and this old Cold War method does it better than most bulky suits ever could. Even wildlife photographers have rediscovered this approach, stretching mesh over cameras and lenses to blur their outlines without adding weight. Bushcrafters, trekkers, and survivalists use streak-painted tarps, paired with net overlays to create small hides that disappear. Far better than massive brush piles or vegetation-stuffed cloaks. For decades, this method sat quietly in the margins of history, effective, simple, and largely forgotten. But the troops who used it knew its value. They understood that concealment wasn't about looking like a bush. It was about not looking like anything at all. It was about dissolving the human shape into the visual noise of the world. If uncovering this lost piece of Cold War fieldcraft deepened your understanding, consider subscribing to In the Beginning and sharing this story with others who love history, survival skills, and the subtle art of staying unseen. The channel grows when viewers like you keep these old lessons alive, lessons that prove sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones no one remembers.